You're listening to Inside the Village, where all news is local and no topic is off limits.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley. Hey, bully in the alley. So help me, Bob.
Welcome to Inside the Village, across the Village Media Network and wherever you get your favorite podcast, with Michael Friscolanti, editor-in-chief here at Village Media. I'm Scott Sexsmith. Great to see you, pal. Nice to be back.
Right on. Good to see you.
We're going to do something a little different this week. A little off script, a little off format.
Yeah, which is not something we usually do. So we're going to give it a shot. We may fall on our faces, but we're gonna do our best. We
Won't
made
be
it
the
this
first
far.
time, and it's certainly not going to be the last.
That's right. No, for sure. You know, at Village, we always talk to you. I feel like a broken record sometimes, but we're always talking about the great local journalism we do in all our markets and the stories we tell that are very important to help people live their day-to-day lives. We're also doing some other things at Village, right? We're expanding our storytelling. We're doing some longer features at Village, some big reads, as we call them, some medium reads as well, trying to dig deeper into some stories that matter. We're also expanding our use of video. Our readers will probably see that we're doing more video on our websites, telling stories through video. And, of course, this podcast is one of those examples that goes up on the site every week. We also have the show that you're hosting, Up Close and Personal, which is another example of sort of deeper dive interviews that we can accomplish here at Village. You've been doing it for, I think, longer than the podcast, right?
Yeah. We started it, I believe it was back in March of this year, and in fact, we kind of dipped our toe in the water the year prior when we sat down and talked to Brian Baumler from HGTV as he was launching the third season of Island of Bryan. So it does have some history to it for sure.
Right on, I remember that. And I think we've really taken this studio for a test drive, and we're kind of getting the engine revving, and we're doing a lot more of that kind of stuff now, your show included. So I think the goal today is to maybe introduce some of our Inside the Village audience to Up Close and Personal. They may not know it exists, they may not know it's around, so it's a chance for us to showcase that today.
Yeah, it's a fun little show that we get to put together, once or twice a month, and the audience has certainly heard us talk about our executive producer Derek, and Derek is also the brains behind Up Close and deals very closely on it. And we've been fortunate, Frisco, over the several months that we've done it, that we've talked to some pretty prominent Canadians, some really big guests, and you and I thought it might be kind of fun today if we looked at a handful of them and maybe ran some clips and maybe had a little behind the scenes discussion about each of them. So I'm looking forward to that.
For sure, it's like an in case you missed it kind of thing, but it's also important too because these are great conversations you're having, and they're longer conversations. I think in this age of instant news and immediate information, it's nice to be able to have a chat with somebody who has a great story to tell, and you can spend 35, 45 minutes listening to what they have to say.
Absolutely, and that's the thing, and that's the beauty of it, is everybody has a story to tell, and we're lucky that we get to tell them with the individuals, and it's pretty cool. So let's take a break, and we'll come back and get it going.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
All right. Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. TrueNorthMortgage.ca. Inside the Village returns right after this.
From newsmakers to celebrities to other prominent guests, you'll find them all on Village Media's new interview series, Up Close and Personal. Join host Scott Sexsmith as he goes one-on-one with well-known Canadians to hear their story. Up Close and Personal. Look for it on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back to this special episode of, can I call it a special episode of Inside the Village?
I think it's special.
I think it's special because you're here. See, you have no comeback for that.
I have no comeback.
It is very seldom that you are at a loss for words.
I think I had about 4 or 5 in my head, but none of them were not appropriate.
Not suitable for this audience.
Not suitable for this audience.
Inside the Village is brought to you by True North Mortgage. True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. We've been talking about some of the guests that we've had on Up Close and Personal, and there have been a lot of them. And I think one of my favorites, and he's certainly no stranger to Canadian households, the former anchor of the CTV National News, Lloyd Robertson.
For sure, an absolute legend in our business, right? One of the most trusted broadcast journalists we've ever known. Great story, huge believer in journalism, just a great journalist.
Yeah, and we all know, having watched him, 5 nights a week for decades, that Lloyd ended every newscast with this phrase, and that's the kind of day it's been. And when he and I sat down, I asked him, where did that come from?
it came up late in the 90s when I decided I would try it just, for a little while to see how it worked. And it caught on. People began to say it back to me when I was on the street. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's getting a little much. So I stopped doing it in the year 2000, at the turn of the century. And the next day, the chief news editor walked into me and said, Lloyd, please put the sign up back on. I've had all kinds of calls and emails from people saying, what happened to, and that's the kind of day it's been. So I put it back in and continued on with it for the rest of my time on the desk.
The one thing I loved about your interview with Lloyd was him talking about his early days in Stratford, right? When he was a young nobody who just dreamed of being a journalist, and him working the radio station.
Yeah.
It was fantastic, right? And for him, when you do a job like that in that era, you understand just how important local journalism is. So I really enjoyed that part of the conversation.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. And I think back to, when Lloyd was speaking about his radio days and these 14, 15, 16-hour days that he would put in every day. And he was just so passionate and so in love with the business that he didn't care. But you're right, local journalism certainly strikes a chord with him. And he told us why it's so important.
Always been. Because it goes right back to the beginning of people telling one another stories about what was going on the street. You used to have the town crier going around and doing the headlines to people. So news is really quite a basic function in our lives. It's telling people about what's going on in their neighborhood, in their cities and towns, and right across the world. And villages, the Village Voice, and your own operation become extremely important because you're right there on the ground, giving people the information they need to live day by day. And unfortunately, over the last several years, because of the big conglomerates that have been formed, a lot of the local services have dried up because they can't afford to compete. Or if they are competing, they're competing with one little column in a big newspaper. So that's unfortunate. And it's great to see that so many of these other operations are cropping up to serve those audiences that are left behind in these situations because of the evolution of the industry.
One of the absolute legends, Lloyd Robertson, the longest serving anchor, national anchor in television history. Did you know that?
I did. From your interview, I knew that. I knew he's been there a long time. He knows the longest. But, you can listen, you hear that voice. Obviously he looks older than he did when he was on TV. We all get older, but it sounds exactly the same.
Man, you close your eyes and it's just like listening to him, sitting behind the anchor desk at CTV. So let's make the shift, Frisco, from one of the all-time legends who did it for decades and decades to someone who surprisingly has next month done it for 3 decades at TVO, Steve Paikin.
Yeah, Steve Paikin. Again, I really enjoyed Steve's interview. He's somebody, obviously, I have huge respect for, and all journalists have huge respect for what he does. He tackles big issues on his program. He gets the guests on the need to be answering questions. He's great at interviewing politicians at campaign time. I always watch his show. It's really good.
Yeah. Now, the first time I met Steve, he was the chancellor at Laurentian University, and both of our girls went to Laurentian University. And it was always great to see him on stage as each kid would come up to get their diploma. He would spend a minute or two talking to them. And I remember him saying that he used it as a mini focus group to talk to each student to see how was your experience at Laurentian, where did we fall short, where did we do really well. And Laurentian really became a big part of this storyline.
It doesn't shock me at all that he would be asking those kind of questions to each graduate as they come up. Right? He's always trying to learn something.
So as we know, last year, Laurentian went through or started the insolvency process, and Steve Paikin resigned the position of chancellor as a result of that. And we had a really great conversation surrounding what was happening at Laurentian University.
I've tried really hard not to answer that question for a long time because I've not wanted to be a distraction to all of what the university has to go through right now. Here's what I can say about all that, Scott. I didn't know any of that was coming down. People may not know, but there are various kinds of chancellors. There are some chancellors who, talk daily to the presidents of their institutions. They go out and do fundraising for the institution. They lobby government for the institution. That was not me, because I'm in journalism, I was the exact opposite.
Right.
You know, I did all the ceremonial stuff for Laurentian. I presided over convocation. I presided over big events. I never lobbied government. I never raised money for them. I just, I wasn't allowed to do that kind of stuff. So when the developments at Laurentian took place, nobody was more shocked than me. I had no sense at all that it was about to happen. I had had a conversation with the president and the board chair, 6 weeks before that announcement was made. It was all pleasantries in the meeting. There was no indication given by either one of them that anything untoward was about to happen. And so I was truly shocked when it did happen. And given everything that had happened and how out of the mix I clearly was about the whole thing, I guess I concluded there wasn't much point in hanging around, and it was too controversial at that point anyway. Remember, I'm in journalism. I think the deal with Laurentian in the first place was, as long as things stay uncontroversial, this is something we'll let you do. But once it got controversial, that was a problem.
And when it did come out, Steve, did it surprise you that it was as bad as it was?
Oh, for sure. I'd been affiliated. Remember, the current president of Laurentian was, if I can put it this way, my third president. I'd worked with two of them before that. And by all objective criteria that I had seen during my time there, things seemed quite successful. We had a goodly number of students going there. We had great philanthropic donations to the university happening while I was there. The place seemed to be well managed. Every time, I'll tell you what, when you're the chancellor and you give out degrees to thousands of people twice a year, unlike other universities, which sort of bring the students come up, they get their degrees, it's a handshake, it's a picture, and gone, they're gone. At Laurentian, what I loved about convocation was we really took our time, and each student came up. I handed them their degree. The president and I would have a little conversation with them. I'd ask them, how was your experience here? It was great focus group. I could find out how optimistic they were about their future, about the job market, about what their next moves were in life, how much they enjoyed or didn't the Laurentian experience. All of that stuff, all of those, indicators were all very positive. So yeah, I was beyond shocked when the developments took place.
I guess one thought that went through the minds of parents and students and likely still does is, if this can happen at Laurentian, what's to say it couldn't happen at any university across the province of Ontario?
Scott, there's nothing to say it couldn't happen. And that's the truth. I mean, the precarious nature of post-secondary education in the province of Ontario today is something that I think none of us is as on top of as we need to be. And for a bunch of reasons. Number one, the provincial allocation, and I'm not being a critic here, I'm just saying a fact. The provincial allocation to post-secondary universities is certainly not as high as some people think it ought to be. Tuition has been frozen for 3 years by the current government, which means in a world of 6 or 7% inflation, they are really falling further and further behind as they try to provide programming. They are increasingly dependent on foreign students in order to make the bottom line. I mean, Cape Breton University in the Maritimes, 50% of the student body is from out of the country. I mean, that is a very dangerous situation. I mean, it's great on the one hand. It's great that the world wants to come here and have their students be educated by our terrific post-secondary institutions. But if for whatever reason they turn the taps off, we're there with our pants down. And that's very scary. So yeah, I sure hope that what happened at Laurentian doesn't happen anywhere else.
What was great about that clip is it obviously broke some news as well. That was very newsworthy what he said. Steve hadn't really talked a lot, if at all, about his role there and what happened after he heard about the insolvency. Heidi Ulrichsen, our great reporter at Sudbury.com, has been covering this from day one. And she jumped on that interview and wrote a story about it because there was some news in there.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a great interview and fun to spend some time with him. Okay, we've got some more guests lined up that we're going to take a trip back down memory lane and share some segments with you and some behind-the-scenes details with the likes of Ron MacLean and Kathleen Wynne. And we'll do that next on Inside the Village.
She had my heart, oh, very nearly.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read. It's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
So help me, Bob, it's bully in the alley.
We're back on Inside the Village, brought to you by True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash with Michael Friscolanti. Frisco, I'm Scott Sexsmith, Inside the Village, with a bit of an up-close and personal slant. And thanks for indulging and letting us talk about some of the people that we've talked about over the last several months. I got to be honest, though, one of my all-time favorites, host of Hockey Night in Canada, Ron MacLean.
Yeah, I mean, Ron MacLean, we've all grown up watching Ron MacLean and Don Cherry as well. I mean, that was part of my childhood, watching that every Saturday night. And you just take for granted that a guy like Ron is on the TV every Saturday night doing that job week in and week out, year after year.
And what was funny about our sit down with Ron, and not many know this, but he was in COVID quarantine when we set it up. And we should give the backstory when you set up these kinds of interviews, and you've done this countless times, so you know, it's not like you pick up the phone and you call the subject matter. You've got people to go through. There's gatekeepers, there's publicists, there's management, there's PR people, and it was the PR people at Sportsnet that we dealt with. And the instructions were, you've got 20 minutes, no more, no less. So in speaking with Ron, I say to Ron, because how many times have we heard him on the desk say this, we're tight for time.
Yeah.
And he's like, tight for time? You kidding me? I've been in quarantine for 12. I'll sit here and talk to you all day long. and we, the beauty of a guy like Ron is he's a dream interview, because you ask him one question and he will go on eloquently for 15 minutes without skipping a beat. So we had a wonderful conversation. He's a gem of a human being, but we couldn't have the discussion without talking about the Don Cherry Coach's Corner situation that happened a couple of years ago.
Yeah, extremely hard. I think it would be Don's answer to know if he decided it's his time. It certainly was a case of all we needed to do was apologize for the misstep and move on. And that didn't happen. So that was really hard for me. I was in the middle of doing hometown hockey in Welland on the Sunday when it was all going down. Really hard to have a face-to-face over a beer, looked on. We need to, do this to make it work. And that didn't happen. And, I was boxed into a corner where I had to kind of do the apology on the Sunday. That was always the one regret I had, is that, to sit home as Don would have and watch me apologize on our behalf. I've had to apologize for fellow broadcasters in the past, and I never like it. I don't think it's chivalrous. I don't think it's right to be the spokesperson for another's mistake. I had made my own by not calling Don out in the short moment that maybe I could have. But yeah, that was the one clumsy part of the day. And then after that, I think Don made a decision, and then I had to live with it. I was so comfortable with the principle of the argument, Scott, that, we had made a mistake. You cannot project an attitude on immigrants. However harmless it may have seemed, it absolutely was wrong. And to carry on was hard, because it meant I had to then say, okay, well, are you going to be the courage of your convictions and stand on the principle that you believe in and keep working? Or are you going to fall on your sword and just go away as kind of, there goes Batman and Robin. It was fun, and they'll be loved for life, even if they're recognized as having made a mistake. I couldn't live with sort of condoning that mistake. It was very important to carry on and sort of try and fight for my principles.
Yeah, right? and I guess the follow-up would be, is there love for life? How's the relationship, or is there one today?
For sure. Yeah, for sure. Don, we talk and we share season tickets. We'll get into all, it's not easy to, I don't want to poke at the issue, no. So I kind of keep a distance a little bit. But yeah, I mean, how could you, we were technically together 33 years, Scott, and we were as opposite as day as long. But that was the joy, right? It was, we would sit, he would sit after the playoff game and want to watch Donald Trump on Fox News, and I was rolling my eyes, and he vice versa. When I was reading my, those books I read, he would say,
right.
So, but that made for, I liked in a way that we were opposites, because, that's where we're at in our world, is trying to, everything people think it's all politics, this polarization of the world, but it's not. It's actually groups finding a social identity, finding your own identity, as maybe even a citizen journalist, doing your research, doing your own thinking for yourself, and finding like-minded. We're all packing. We're all finding ways to get into a group that makes us feel good, and that's what's divisive. Until we can sort of break down this propensity to want to be with like-minded folk, we're going to have issues that are hard to resolve. And I'm sure that's time immemorial, that conundrum. But in the case of Don and me, as much as I like to think we were differences and it was good to shine a light as the two of us, we're still two white guys, with our own history that's very similar. We were by far, no means the panacea.
I was glad to hear, Scott, what you said about Ron, because he seems like such a good guy when you watch him on TV. So it's good to hear that he was just as good a guy when you met him. And I have to say, as a journalist, I've always appreciated his yearly conversations with Gary Bettman. Right? He leaves nothing off the table. Right? These are very hard-hitting, difficult conversations, and they're almost difficult to watch as a viewer, right? But he never gave up those hard questions that he had to ask, and they have to be like, they're must-see interviews every year when he sits down with Gary Bettman.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up, because I asked Ron about that, and I said, are they as awkward for you sitting there doing them as they are for us as the viewer watching them? Because it's like a traffic accident. You don't want to look, but you do, and you feel bad for doing it. And,
yeah.
And he had some interesting comments.
Yeah, and I have to give Gary Bettman credit too, because he sits there and he answers the questions. He knows his stuff too, right? So it's a great back and forth. It's it's the kind of stuff we strive for on the podcast, to have good conversations like that.
Absolutely. And the thing with Gary, and Ron's the first one to say it, is Gary is a lawyer by trade. Mm-hmm. So he's a wonderful orator, and he can speak with the best of them.
Knows his facts as well, right? I mean, the guy knows what he's talking about.
Yeah. So another thing that Ron and I got to talking about, because I was curious, he's been doing this for so long. How much longer are you going to do it? And he provided some interesting perspective, which I didn't expect.
I do see succession as important. I was kind of happy when George took over. I was willing to move from the way I kind of analogize it, from the first line to the fourth line. I was still doing Coach's Corner, which was a pretty watched segment of the show, but that's all I was doing. And then I would do the hometown hockey, which I adore. I was a child of Wide World of Sports, and I could go on about that. But with Hockey Night, there's 4 years left on the Rogers deal, Scott, so it kind of stands to reason. I'm 62, just turned 62. If I could make it to the end of that deal, I would be happy with that. And but I've never been a goal setter, and I'm certainly not a clinger honor. I don't try not to be attached to, I think the big battle in life is to cope with impermanence in our health, in our careers. And, we don't deal with it that well, but I've shaped my whole life because of being an only child and being uprooted over and again. I've taught myself, or tried to teach myself, to accept change and be cool with change, and know that sometimes that change is pennies from heaven, could actually be for the best. So if one day they come in and say, Ron, we'd like to get some young blood in the chairs, say, great.
Oh, that was great. He was a lot of fun to spend some time with. Now, speaking of retirement, one person who did just retire a few weeks ago that we had the pleasure of speaking with was the 25th Premier of Ontario, Kathleen Wynne.
I enjoyed this conversation as well, because it's a real behind-the-scenes piece, right? You get to talk to somebody who's been in the spotlight, in the headlines for years, leaving a very controversial legacy behind. Kathleen is, right? I mean, there are people when they hear her name, they cringe, right? So for her to come on and explain her perspective on things is really important.
Yeah, she was a wonderful chat, and I wish we were rolling tape prior to starting, because we had some technical difficulties for about 45 minutes, and Derek can attest to this. She couldn't hear us, we couldn't hear her, then she couldn't see us, we couldn't see. It was a calamity of errors, and we all had a good laugh about it. But she was a good sport. So one of the things that I wanted to ask her, because I loved the behind the scenes stuff, and I said, Kathleen, walk me through day one. What happens? You wake up, you're lying in bed, and all of a sudden you realize you're the Premier of Ontario.
So it's funny, yeah. So I told you we were in the middle of a renovation. So we were living in the basement apartment of some friends of ours in Cabbagetown, which is a very old part of Toronto with, an old Victorian house. We were in low ceiling basement. And I remember waking up that morning and I got the paper. I was getting, the Star and the Globe and the Sun, and I was looking at the paper, and I remember clearly reading an article about the premier and just going past it and thinking Dalton, and then realizing, holy mackerel, they're talking about me. And Jane describes those few days as like a mantle of responsibility settling on my shoulders. And it was frightening, because I felt that, and I felt the responsibility. There was the excitement. That day I went to a scrum with the press, and there were all sorts of questions coming at me, which I love. I didn't hold back from that. I love interacting with the press, and I was very energized, but man, I was anxious about what was coming, because I had been part of Dalton's team. We were not in a very good place in 2012. Nobody expected us to be able to, get a budget passed. We were in a minority government, and I knew I was going to have to work with Andrea Horvath or Tim Hudak to get a budget passed, and neither of those people was too interested in working with me.
Right.
And we had to get going very quickly, because I'd made a commitment that we'd get back on the regular schedule of the legislature, and so that gave us only a couple of weeks to get going. So all of that was happening at the same time.
So day one, does it go like this? You shower, you get ready for work, and all of a sudden the Secret Service, or at least the OPP's version of the Secret Service, shows up to drive you to the legislature, and you get to your new office, and you're putting a nice picture of Jane on your desk and getting set up. Like, is it like that?
Yeah. Well, what happened was Dalton was still making the transition out of the office in the Queen's Park, the Pink Palace building, right? So I was in the auxiliary office across the street at the Whitney block, and I could look across the Queen's Park and see the building. And it was kind of this strange situation where Dalton was shutting down his office, and there was transition stuff happening there, and we were doing our own transition. And I was writing out the issues that I wanted my ministers to tackle, and trying to figure out who the ministers were going to be. We had the whiteboard with the members on it, and who the ministers were going to be, and what the mandate letters were going to say. And I was doing that literally on a pad of foolscap. Meanwhile, Dalton was over in his office, and we didn't really see each other during that period, because there were staff changes happening. I was getting my chiefs of staff in place. But yes, got up in the morning, showered, the OPP picked me up, took me down to Queen's Park, and I walked into this office, and there really was nothing in the alternate office in the Whitney block. It was just this big room, and it's the office that Mike Harris had set up, because he wanted not to have to go past all the protesters when he went into the main building. So he had this alternate office set up, and I actually liked it. It was a great office, but it was surreal, Scott. The whole thing was surreal. I really, sitting at that desk by myself, I had to pinch myself many, many times.
Oh, what a great story. So we go from that to fast forward through the pandemic, and I was really interested to know what Kathleen thought about the job that Premier Ford and his cabinet was doing through the coronavirus pandemic.
And this detail that you flush out in this interview here really caught me off guard. It was really interesting.
Yeah, and it was surprising to me, as I'm sure it was to anybody who's seen it, and certainly to you who will see it now. Premier Ford actually reached out to the former premier to seek her advice.
Yeah, that's an interesting little story. So just as the pandemic was starting, if you remember, it was sort of at the beginning of March break in March 2020. And Doug Ford was on a radio show, and he was asked about people going, or I guess the press asked him about people going on March break. And a lot of people were starting to feel anxious about traveling at that point. But he said, oh, everybody should just go away and have a good time. He kind of waved his hand and said, everybody go and have a good time. I was then on a radio show later that same day, and I was asked by Jerry Agar on Talk 1010 in Toronto, which is, not a radio station that is, it's not a liberal radio station. It's definitely supportive of Ford. And I was expected, I think, to go off on him and to really lambaste him, but I didn't feel that, because I knew the guy well enough to know that he was just trying to be generous and kind, and he was trying not to scare people. And so I said, I think Premier Ford was talking from the bottom of his heart. I think he was. But here's the thing: you can't do that. You can't freelance when you are the leader and you are in a situation that is as serious as this one. So he called me afterwards and he thanked me for not taking off on him, but actually understanding where he was coming from. Because he said to me, Kathleen, I was speaking from the bottom of my heart. And then he asked me for my advice. And I said, Doug, are you really asking me? And he said, yeah, I want to know. And I said, well, I think from here on in, you need to be at the podium with your Minister of Health, there with you, and you need to be reassuring people and telling them what's going on. I had the brief experience of the ice storm in 2013 in December, and I went on every day and gave people a report with the people from Toronto Hydro and Ontario Hydro, or Hydro One, and tried to tell them what was going on. So that was just a brief window on what he was dealing with, and I knew that that's what he needed to do. Now, I'm not suggesting he followed my advice, but he did do that. And I think he was probably getting that advice from a bunch of different quarters.
I love that insight. And that's one of the cool things about Up Close and Personal, is we get that behind the scenes, kind of peek behind the curtain. Who would have ever thought that the current premier would have reached out to a former premier, different sides of the political spectrum, to seek advice? At the end, they are just people that put their pants on one leg at a time.
I think we're oblivious to the fact that probably happens a lot more than we realize, right? I mean, these are, like you said, people are doing this job. She's done it before. You're going to reach out for that kind of advice and look to people who've been in your shoes before.
Yeah, and the one thing that I said to her when we were wrapping up, and I think it holds true, it's not about your political stripes or who you side with. I think that politicians in general and as a rule deserve our thanks, because they put their hand up and their name forward, because at the end of the day, they just want to better the place that they live, the province that we live in, and the country that we live in. And I think that she did just that.
I think you're right. I think a lot of them get into it for the right reasons. I think that when they get there, I think the exhaustion kicks in and you realize how little you can actually accomplish as an individual MPP, for example. And that's why there's a lot of discussion about maybe we need to change some of those things.
Yeah, for sure. All right, this has been a real nice look back. Thanks for doing it, and let's come back and wrap up Inside the Village right after this.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
All right, we're back to wrap on Inside the Village with Michael Friscolanti. I'm Scott Sexsmith, brought to you by True North Mortgage, where you'll get great advice and save a pile of cash. TrueNorthMortgage.ca. Well, thanks for this. This was fun. I mentioned that through my time hosting Up Close and Personal, I think Ron MacLean was probably one of my favorites. Anybody stand out to you?
Yeah, there were a couple. I definitely think that one you did with the new editor-in-chief of Village Media really stood out. That one was, it kind of was a little bit above the rest, like the depth, the personality, the experience, those kind of things. And I think the guy was wearing the same shirt as I'm wearing today when I did that interview, but that one definitely sticks out.
Like you, when we started, I have no words.
That's right, buddy. Best to end that way.
Other than thanks for another great episode, and we'll do it again next week. InsideTheVillage.ca is where you'll find all of our back episodes, of course, across the Village Media Network and wherever you get your favorite podcasts. For Michael Friscolanti, Michael Same Shirt Friscolanti, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for watching and listening. Have a great week. See you next Wednesday.
You've been listening to Inside the Village.
Frisco and Scott's Wardrobe, provided in part by Moores, Sault Ste. Marie.